The wind screamed like a dying animal across the frozen plains of Montana Territory, and Florence Dawson knew with absolute certainty that her husband had just left her to die. She stood trembling in the ankle-deep snow that was rapidly climbing higher, watching the covered wagon disappear into the white curtain of the blizzard. Walter had barely looked at her when he told her to get out. His face had been hard as stone, his eyes colder than the ice forming on her eyelashes. She had begged him, pleaded with him to explain what she had done wrong, but he had only pointed into the storm and told her that he never wanted to see her face again. The wagon rolled away, taking with it everything she owned, every memory of the life they had built together over the past 3 years, and any hope she had for survival. Florence wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did nothing against the brutal Montana winter. They had been traveling from Marysville, California, where they had spent the last year trying to make a go of mining. Walter had been bitter about their failures there, blaming her for his bad luck, for the empty pans and the dwindling savings. When he suggested they head north to Montana Territory, where his brother supposedly had land and opportunity, she had agreed without question. She had been a good wife. She had cooked and cleaned and never complained about the hardships, but something had changed in Walter during those final weeks. He had grown distant and cruel, and she had caught him counting their money with a strange gleam in his eyes. Now she understood. He had been planning this. The blizzard was the perfect excuse, the perfect cover. No one would question a man who said his wife had wandered off in a storm and gotten lost. No one would blame him for her death. Her feet were already numb inside her worn boots. The snow was falling so thick now that she could barely see her own hands in front of her face. She tried to walk, tried to move in the direction she thought might lead to shelter, but the wind pushed her back, mocking her efforts. Her dress was soaked through, the fabric heavy and freezing against her skin. She fell once, then twice, her knees sinking into the deep drifts. The third time she fell, she wondered if she should even bother getting up. Florence was 23 years old, and she was going to die on this empty stretch of Montana wilderness, abandoned by a man who had promised to love and protect her. The injustice of it burned in her chest even as her body grew colder. She thought of her mother back in Ohio, who had warned her about marrying a man she barely knew. She thought of the dreams she had once had of children and a warm home and a husband who looked at her with kindness. All of it was being buried under the snow. She did not know how long she lay there. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the white chaos. Her mind began to drift, thoughts becoming sluggish and strange. She thought she heard horses, but dismissed it as the wind playing tricks. She thought she saw a dark shape moving through the storm, but her eyes were nearly frozen shut. Then strong hands were gripping her arms, lifting her from the snow, and a deep voice was shouting something she could not quite make out. The man who pulled her from the snow was tall and broad-shouldered, his face half hidden by a thick scarf and a wide-brimmed hat crusted with ice. He said something else, but the wind tore the words away. Florence tried to speak, tried to tell him that she was too cold, too tired, but her lips would not form the sounds. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest, and she felt the warmth of him even through his heavy coat. She wanted to tell him to save his strength, that it was too late for her, but darkness was closing in around the edges of her vision. When she opened her eyes again, she was inside. The first thing she registered was warmth, blessed warmth that made her skin prickle and burn as sensation returned to her frozen limbs. She was lying on something soft, covered in heavy blankets, and a fire crackled somewhere nearby. She tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. Every muscle ached and her head felt strange and light. Easy now. Do not try to move yet. The voice was deep and calm, with a slight drawl that marked him as a man of the West. Florence turned her head slowly and saw him sitting beside the fire. He had removed his hat and scarf, revealing a face that was weathered and strong, with dark hair and eyes that held a quiet intensity. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most, with a few days' worth of stubble on his jaw. "You were nearly frozen solid when I found you. Another few minutes and you would have been gone. Where am I?" Her voice came out as a hoarse whisper, her throat raw from the cold. "My winter cabin. It is not much, but it keeps the wind out." He stood and walked over to a small stove where a pot was heating. He ladled something into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink this. It is just broth, but it will help warm you from the inside." Florence struggled to sit up, and he moved quickly to help her, propping pillows behind her back. His hands were gentle despite their size, calloused from hard work but careful. She took the cup and sipped the hot liquid, feeling it spread warmth through her chest. "Thank you. You saved my life. What were you doing out in that storm?" He sat back down, studying her with those dark eyes. "No one should be out in weather like that without proper gear and a horse at the very least." The memory came flooding back, and with it came a wave of humiliation and anger that made her hands shake. She set the cup down carefully on the small table beside the bed. "My husband left me there. He told me to get out of the wagon and then he drove away." The man's expression darkened. "He did what?" "He abandoned me in the blizzard." Saying it out loud made it real in a way that made her chest tighten. "I do not know why. He just said he did not want to see me anymore and told me to get out. Then he left." For a long moment, the man said nothing. His jaw worked as though he was grinding his teeth, and his hands curled into fists where they rested on his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hard. "That is murder, plain and simple. A man who would do that to his wife is no man at all. It does not matter now." Florence felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "He is gone and I have nothing. No money, no belongings, nothing but the clothes I was wearing. You have your life. That counts for something." He stood and moved to a small trunk in the corner of the cabin. He pulled out a thick wool shirt and a pair of socks. "These will be too big for you, but they are dry and warm. Your clothes are hanging by the fire to dry, but they are in poor shape. When the storm clears, I will take you to the nearest town." "What town? Where are we exactly?" "About 15 miles northeast of Virginia City. This is cattle country, though not much can be done with cattle in weather like this. I run a herd on the land about 5 miles from here, but I keep this cabin for when I am checking the northern fence lines in winter." He set the clothes on the foot of the bed. "My name is Garrett Young, by the way. Florence Dawson." She hesitated, then added, "Or I suppose I should say Florence Whitmore. That was my maiden name. I am not sure I want to keep his name anymore. Florence suits you better than whatever his name was." Garrett moved back to the fire and poked at the logs. "I will step outside for a bit so you can change into dry clothes. The storm is still raging, so we will be here for at least tonight, maybe longer depending on how much snow falls." After he left, Florence carefully removed the damp blankets and looked down at herself. Her dress was gone, and she was wearing what looked like a man's undershirt that came down to her knees. Her face flushed as she realized Garrett must have removed her wet clothes to keep her from freezing. It had been necessary to save her life, but the intimacy of it made her feel strange and vulnerable. She quickly pulled on the wool shirt he had given her, which hung on her like a dress, and the thick socks that came up past her knees. When Garrett returned, stamping snow from his boots, she was sitting up in bed with the blankets pulled around her waist. He had been gone longer than necessary, she realized, giving her extra time to compose herself. It was a kindness that made her throat tighten. How are you feeling?" He brushed snow from his shoulders and hung his coat on a peg by the door. Warmer. Still tired, but better. She watched as he moved around the small cabin with easy familiarity. It was a simple place, just one room with the bed in one corner, a small kitchen area with the stove, a table with 2 chairs, and the fireplace that provided most of the heat. "How did you find me? I thought I was alone out there." "I was riding back from checking on my cattle when the storm hit. I saw wagon tracks heading north and thought it was strange since the weather was clearly turning bad. Then I saw you in the snow." His expression grew grim. "At first I thought you were already dead. You were not moving and the snow was starting to cover you. I think I had given up." The admission felt heavy. "I did not see the point in fighting anymore." Garrett looked at her sharply. "Do not say that. You fought to stay alive long enough for me to find you. That took strength." They fell into silence, listening to the wind howl outside. Florence studied Garrett when she thought he was not looking. He moved with the confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, someone who knew his place in the world. His clothes were simple but well made, the clothes of a working cattleman. There was something solid and dependable about him, something that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in a long time. "Tell me about your cattle," she said, wanting to break the silence. "Is it difficult work?" Garrett glanced at her, surprised by the question. "It can be. Especially in winter like this. You have to make sure they have enough food, that they do not freeze or get lost in storms. Spring is when you have the calving season, and that is when you really earn your keep. But I like the work. I like being out on the land, like seeing the herd grow each year." "Have you always been a cattleman?" "No. I grew up in Texas, worked on my father's ranch until I was 20. Then I headed north looking for my own opportunity. Spent a few years as a ranch hand in Wyoming before I saved enough to buy my own land here in Montana Territory. That was 4 years ago. It has been hard work, but it is mine." There was pride in his voice, the pride of a man who had built something with his own hands. "That sounds like a good life." Florence felt a pang of envy. She had never had anything that was truly hers, had never known that kind of independence. "It can be lonely," Garrett admitted. He was stirring the pot on the stove, adding what looked like dried meat and vegetables to the broth. "Most of the other ranchers around here have families. I have been so focused on building the herd and improving the land that I have not thought much about settling down. But on nights like this, when the wind is howling and the cold is seeping through the walls, it would be nice to have someone to talk to." The vulnerability in his words touched something deep in Florence's chest. Here was a man who was strong and capable, who had saved her life without hesitation, and yet he was admitting to loneliness. It made him seem more real, more human. "What about you?" Garrett asked. "How did you end up married to a man who would leave you to die?" Florence took a shaky breath. It was a question she had been asking herself. "I met Walter 3 years ago in Ohio. He was charming and confident, and he promised me adventure. I was young and foolish, and I believed him. We married quickly and headed west. At first, things were good. But then the money started running out and his charm disappeared. He blamed me for everything that went wrong. When we got to Marysville last year, I thought maybe things would get better, but they only got worse. Did he hurt you?" The question was quiet but intense. "Not with his fists, if that is what you mean, but words can hurt too. He had a way of making me feel small and worthless, like I was the reason for every failure." She looked down at her hands. "I started to believe him. Started to think that maybe I was the problem." "You are not the problem." Garrett's voice was firm. "A real man does not tear down his wife. He builds her up, supports her. What your husband did to you, both in that wagon and before, that is on him, not you." The conviction in his words made tears spring to Florence's eyes. She had not realized how much she needed to hear someone say that, to tell her that she was not to blame for Walter's cruelty. "Thank you," she whispered. Garrett brought over 2 bowls of the stew he had been making and handed her one. "Eat. You need to get your strength back." They ate in comfortable silence, the storm continuing to rage outside. The stew was simple but hearty, and Florence found herself eating more than she had in weeks. When she was finished, exhaustion hit her like a wave. "You should rest," Garrett said, taking her empty bowl. "I will keep the fire going through the night." "Where will you sleep?" Florence looked around the small cabin and realized there was only one bed. "I will make do by the fire. I have slept in worse places." He was already pulling blankets from the trunk, arranging them on the floor near the hearth. "That does not seem fair. You saved my life. I should be the one sleeping on the floor." Garrett turned to look at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You nearly died today. You need the bed more than I do. Besides, it is my cabin. I make the rules." Florence wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She lay back down, pulling the heavy blankets up to her chin. As she drifted off to sleep, she found herself feeling safer than she had in years, despite everything that had happened. There was something about Garrett Young that made her believe everything might actually be all right. She woke in the middle of the night to find the cabin nearly dark, only the faint glow of the banked fire providing any light. For a moment, she panicked, not remembering where she was. Then she heard the steady breathing of Garrett sleeping near the fire, and the memories came flooding back. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the wind, and wondered what would happen when the storm ended. Would Garrett take her to Virginia City and leave her there? What would she do with no money, no belongings, no way to support herself? The future stretched before her, uncertain and frightening. But then she remembered the feeling of Garrett's arms around her, the way he had carried her through the storm. She remembered the kindness in his eyes and the anger in his voice when he spoke of what Walter had done. Maybe, just maybe, she had been given a second chance at life. And if she had, she was not going to waste it being afraid. The storm continued through the next day. Florence woke to find Garrett already up, heating water on the stove. Her dress and undergarments were dry now, hanging on a line he had strung across one corner of the cabin. She dressed quickly while he stepped outside, grateful to be back in her own clothes even though they were worn and shabby. "The snow is deep," Garrett reported when he came back in, carrying an armload of firewood. 3 feet at least, and it is still coming down. We will be here another night, maybe 2. I am sorry to be such a burden." Florence felt guilty that she was taking up his time and resources. "You are not a burden." Garrett stacked the wood by the fire and brushed snow from his hair. "Besides, I like the company. It beats talking to myself." As the day wore on, they fell into an easy rhythm. Garrett taught her how to make coffee in the battered pot he kept at the cabin, showing her the exact ratio of grounds to water that he preferred. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their lives. Florence told him about growing up in Ohio, about her dreams of seeing the West. Garrett told her about Texas, about learning to rope and ride before he could properly walk, about the day he decided to strike out on his own. "Were your parents angry when you left?" Florence asked. They were sitting at the small table, playing cards with a worn deck Garrett had produced from somewhere. "My father understood. He was a younger son himself, had to make his own way. He knew I needed to build something of my own." Garrett laid down a card. "My mother cried, but she gave me her blessing. I write to them when I can, let them know how I am doing. That must be nice, having that support." Florence thought of her own parents who had passed away from fever when she was 19. It was part of why she had married Walter so quickly. She had been alone and scared, and he had seemed like a solution. What will you do when we get to Virginia City? Garrett asked the question carefully, as though he had been thinking about it for a while. I do not know. Try to find work, I suppose, maybe as a seamstress or a cook. Something to earn enough money to get by. The prospect seemed daunting. She had no references, no one to vouch for her character, and if Walter spread rumors about her, claimed she had run off or been unfaithful, it would be even harder. You could stay here. The words came out quickly, and Garrett looked almost surprised that he had said them. I mean, not here at the cabin, but at my ranch. I could use help with the house, with cooking and such. The place is a mess most of the time since I am always out with the cattle. I could pay you fair wages, give you room and board. Florence stared at him, her heart beating faster. You would do that for me. You barely know me. I know enough. Garrett met her eyes steadily. I know you are brave. You survived being abandoned in a blizzard. I know you are willing to work hard, and I know you need somewhere safe to start over. This could be that place if you want it. The offer was more than Florence had dared to hope for. A job, a place to stay, a chance to build a new life. But more than that, it meant she would not have to say goodbye to Garrett Young just yet. The realization that she did not want to leave him surprised her. She had known him for barely more than a day, and yet she felt more connected to him than she ever had to Walter. I would like that very much, she said softly. Thank you, Garrett. He smiled then, a genuine smile that lit up his whole face and made him look younger. Good. That is settled then. That night, as they prepared for bed, there was a new energy in the cabin. Florence felt something stirring inside her, something she had thought Walter had killed. It was hope, fragile and new, but growing stronger with each passing hour. She lay in bed, listening to Garrett settle down by the fire, and allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to stay at his ranch, to wake up each morning knowing she was safe and wanted. It was a dangerous thing to dream, but she could not help herself. The storm finally broke on the third morning. Florence woke to silence, the howling wind replaced by a deep quiet that seemed to press against the cabin walls. When Garrett opened the door, brilliant sunlight streamed in, reflecting off snow that sparkled like diamonds. The world had been transformed into something beautiful and clean, all traces of the ugliness of her abandonment buried under that pristine white blanket. We should be able to make it back to the ranch today, Garrett said. The snow is deep, but my horse is strong, and I have snowshoes we can use if needed. They ate a quick breakfast and prepared to leave. Garrett bundled Florence in every spare piece of warm clothing he could find, wrapping a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. Then he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, and helped her mount. He climbed up behind her, his arms coming around her to hold the reins, and Florence felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the layers of clothing. The journey was slow and difficult. The snow was even deeper than Garrett had estimated, and several times Buck struggled through drifts that came up to his chest. But the horse was determined, and Garrett guided him with expert skill, finding the paths of least resistance. Florence leaned back against Garrett's chest, feeling the steady strength of him, and felt safer than she had in her entire marriage. They reached the ranch as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The ranch house was larger than the cabin, a solid two-story structure built of logs with a wide porch across the front. There was a barn a short distance away, and several other outbuildings that were half buried in snow. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Florence realized someone must have kept the fires going while Garrett was away. My foreman, Jake, and his wife Mary live in the small house behind the barn, Garrett explained as he helped her down from Buck. They watch over things when I am out on the range. They are good people, you will like them. As if summoned by his words, a man emerged from the barn, waving. He was older than Garrett, probably in his early 40s, with a weathered face and a graying beard. "Boss, we were getting worried. The storm was fierce." It was. "Jake, this is Florence. She will be staying with us, helping with the house." Garrett's introduction was simple, but Florence caught the curious look Jake gave her. "Pleased to meet you, madam. Let me take care of Buck. You both look half frozen." Jake took the horse's reins and led him toward the barn. Garrett ushered Florence into the house, and she looked around with wide eyes. It was indeed a mess, just as he had said. Dishes were piled in the sink, dust covered every surface, and papers and tools were scattered across tables and chairs. But it was also spacious and well built, with large windows that let in light and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. "I know it needs work," Garrett said, sounding almost embarrassed. "I have been meaning to clean it up, but there never seems to be time." "It has good bones," Florence said, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. "It just needs someone to care for it properly." Over the next weeks, Florence threw herself into the work of transforming the house. She cleaned and scrubbed, organized and repaired. She learned to cook on the cast iron stove, experimenting with the supplies in the pantry until she could produce hearty meals that made Garrett smile with satisfaction. She mended his clothes, darned his socks, and made curtains for the windows from fabric Mary helped her find in Virginia City. Mary became a fast friend. She was a warm, motherly woman in her late 30s who had been trying for years to convince Garrett to hire household help. "I have been telling him for months that this place needs a woman's touch," Mary said one afternoon as she and Florence worked together to beat the dust from rugs. "He is a good man, but he lives like a bachelor. It is about time someone civilized him." "He saved my life," Florence said quietly. She had told Mary and Jake a simplified version of what had happened, explaining that her husband had left her during the storm. She did not go into the darker details, but both of them seemed to understand there was more to the story. "Well, he is lucky you are here now. I have not seen him this relaxed in years." Mary gave her a knowing look. "He smiles more, laughs more. You are good for him." The comment made Florence's heart skip. She had noticed changes in Garrett too. He seemed less guarded around her, more willing to talk and share his thoughts. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit by the fire and talk for hours. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to build it into something that would last for generations. She told him about her own dreams, the ones she had buried during her marriage, of having a real home and maybe, someday, children who would grow up knowing they were loved and safe. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, something began to shift between them. Florence would catch Garrett watching her with an expression she could not quite read. His hand would linger when he helped her with her coat. When they sat together in the evenings, he would sit closer than necessary, their shoulders nearly touching. And Florence found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering what it would be like if things were different, if she were free to act on the feelings that were growing in her heart. But she was not free. She was still legally married to Walter, even if he had abandoned her. The thought of him was like a shadow over everything, a reminder that her life was more complicated than she wished it could be. She did not know where Walter was or what he had done after leaving her. Part of her hoped he had continued north and was far away by now. Another part of her, the angry part, hoped he had met with some justice for what he had done. The answer came on a warm day in April when a marshal rode up to the ranch. Florence was hanging laundry when she saw him, and her heart immediately began to pound. Garrett was out with the cattle, and she was alone at the house. She wiped her damp hands on her apron and walked slowly toward the man as he dismounted. "Madam, I am looking for Garrett Young," Is he around?" The marshal was a tall man with a stern face and eyes that had seen too much of the darker side of humanity. "He is out with the herd. Can I help you with something?" Florence tried to keep her voice steady. The marshal studied her carefully. "What is your name, madam?" "Florence Dawson." She hesitated, then added, "Though I am planning to go back to my maiden name." The marshal's eyes widened slightly. "Dawson? Any relation to a Walter Dawson?" Florence felt the blood drain from her face. "He was my husband. Is he dead?" "Yes, madam." "I am sorry to be the one to tell you, but he died about 6 weeks ago. Froze to death in his wagon during that big blizzard we had in February. Some trappers found him just north of here. Appears he had gotten stuck in a snowdrift and could not get out. He had a bottle of whiskey with him, mostly empty. Probably fell asleep drunk and never woke up." The irony was not lost on Florence. Walter had abandoned her to die in that same blizzard, and instead he had been the one to perish. She felt no grief, only a strange sense of closure. "Thank you for telling me, Marshal. There is something else. When we went through his things, we found documents showing he had a wife. That would be you, I assume. There was also money, quite a bit of it, near $1,000 hidden in a trunk. As his legal widow, that money belongs to you now." Florence swayed slightly, overwhelmed by the information. $1,000. That was more money than she had ever imagined having. It was enough to start a new life anywhere she wanted. It was freedom in its purest form. The marshal gave her directions on how to claim the money and Walter's other effects, then tipped his hat and rode away. Florence stood in the yard, watching him go, trying to process what had just happened. She was a widow now. She was free. And she was wealthy enough to never have to depend on anyone again. When Garrett returned that evening, she told him everything. He listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So what will you do now?" he finally asked. "You have money. You can go anywhere, do anything you want." Florence looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the man who had saved her life, who had given her a job and a safe place to stay when she had nothing. But more than that, she saw the man who made her laugh, who listened to her dreams, who looked at her like she was something precious and valuable. She saw the man she had fallen in love with, though she had been too afraid to admit it until now. "I want to stay here," she said softly. "If you will have me, not as your housekeeper, but as something more. I know it has only been a few months and maybe I am being foolish again, but I cannot imagine being anywhere else. I cannot imagine being with anyone else." Garrett crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. "Florence, I have been half in love with you since I pulled you from that snow. Every day you have been here, that feeling has grown stronger. I did not say anything because I thought you needed time, needed space to heal from what he did to you. But if you are saying what I think you are saying, then yes. Yes, 1,000 times. Stay with me. Not as my housekeeper, but as my wife, if you will have me." Florence felt tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you." Garrett pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that was gentle and fierce all at once, a kiss that promised safety and passion and a future full of possibilities. Florence kissed him back, pouring all her hope and love into that moment. She had been abandoned in a blizzard and left to die, but instead she had found something far more valuable than she had ever known. She had found a man who truly loved her, who saw her worth and would never take it for granted. They were married a month later in Virginia City, with Mary and Jake and half the ranchers in the territory standing as witnesses. Florence wore a new dress she had sewn herself from blue fabric that matched her eyes, and Garrett wore his best suit, looking handsome and proud. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her in front of everyone, and the small church erupted in cheers and applause. The ranch flourished over the next years. With Florence managing the household and Garrett focused on the cattle, they built something neither of them could have achieved alone. Florence used some of Walter's money to improve the house, adding a new wing with extra bedrooms. She also invested in better stock for the ranch, buying breeding cattle that improved the quality of the herd. Garrett taught her to ride, and she became a capable horsewoman, sometimes riding out with him to check on the cattle. In the fall of their first year of marriage, Florence discovered she was pregnant. Garrett was overjoyed, treating her like she was made of glass and worrying over her constantly. Mary laughed at his nervousness and assured Florence that childbirth was natural and she would be fine. The baby came in the spring, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. They named him Thomas, after Garrett's father, and the old ranch house rang with the sounds of a baby's cries and laughter. Thomas was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth, who had her mother's stubborn spirit and her father's fearlessness. The children grew up surrounded by love and the wide open spaces of Montana territory. Garrett taught Thomas to ride and rope, while Florence taught Elizabeth her letters and how to sew. But both parents made sure both children learned everything, believing that knowledge and capability were not limited by gender. Florence never forgot the day Walter left her in the blizzard, but the pain of that memory faded over time, replaced by gratitude for the life it had ultimately led her to. Sometimes, on winter nights when the wind howled outside, she would wake and feel a moment of panic, remembering the cold and the fear. But then Garrett would pull her close, his warm body a reminder that she was safe, that she was loved, that she had found her true home. On their 10th anniversary, they stood together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas and Elizabeth were playing in the yard, their laughter carried on the evening breeze. The ranch had grown substantially, and they now employed several ranch hands in addition to Jake and Mary. "You ever regret it?" Garrett asked, his arm around Florence's waist. "Staying here instead of taking that money and starting fresh somewhere new?" Florence leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of the man she loved. "Not for a single moment. This is exactly where I am meant to be. I love you, Florence Young. I have loved you from the moment I found you in that snow, and I will love you until the day I die. And I love you, Garrett. You saved my life in more ways than one." They stood together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a life that was richer and fuller than either had dared to dream. The blizzard that should have killed Florence had instead brought her to the man she was meant to love, and in his arms she had finally found her home. The years continued to pass with the rhythm of the seasons. Thomas grew into a strong young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, while Elizabeth developed a fierce intelligence and a compassion for others that made her parents proud. They had one more child, another son they named William, who came as a surprise when Florence was 35. William was the charmer of the family, able to talk his way out of any trouble with a smile and a quick wit. Garrett's ranch became one of the most successful in the territory, known for its quality cattle and fair treatment of workers. He and Florence were respected throughout the region, sought out for advice, and looked to as examples of what hard work and dedication could achieve. They never forgot their humble beginnings, always willing to help those who were struggling or in need. Florence found particular satisfaction in helping other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. She quietly funded a small shelter in Virginia City for women escaping bad situations, and she made sure that any woman who needed work could find it at the ranch, no questions asked. It was her way of paying forward the kindness Garrett had shown her that terrible day in the blizzard. As they grew older, their love only deepened. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative, faced hardships and celebrated triumphs, and through it all they remained steadfast partners. Garrett still made Florence laugh with his dry humor, and Florence still amazed Garrett with her strength and resilience. They held hands like newlyweds, stole kisses in the kitchen when they thought no one was looking, and never took for granted the gift they had been given in each other. On a warm summer evening when they were both in their 50s, they sat together on the porch swing Garrett had built for their 20th anniversary. Their children were grown now, Thomas running the ranch alongside his father, Elizabeth married to a good man and expecting her first child, and William away at school in the East, determined to become a lawyer. The ranch house was quiet in a way it had not been for years. "Can you believe it has been over 30 years since I found you in that snow?" Garrett asked, his fingers intertwined with Florence's. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like a whole lifetime." Florence smiled, her face still beautiful despite the lines that time had etched around her eyes and mouth. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "What is that?" "I think about how Walter thought he was sentencing me to death, but instead he gave me life. Real life. If he had not left me in that blizzard, I never would have met you. I would have stayed trapped in that miserable marriage, never knowing what it felt like to be truly loved." Garrett brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I think we were always meant to find each other. Maybe it had to happen the way it did. Maybe so. I just wish everyone could know the kind of happiness we have found. The world would be a much better place. We are teaching our children about it. They will carry that forward, teach their children. That is how we change the world, one family at a time." Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and sage and home. "I love you, Garrett Young. Thank you for saving me in every possible way. Thank you for saying yes, for staying, for building this beautiful life with me. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Florence." They sat together as the sun set and the stars came out. Two people who had beaten the odds and found true love in the harsh landscape of the Montana Territory. The blizzard that had nearly killed Florence had instead brought her to her destiny, and every day since had been a gift she cherished. She had been abandoned by one man and saved by another, and in that salvation she had found everything she never knew she was looking for. As the years continued to pass, Florence and Garrett became pillars of their community. They celebrated the marriages of their children, welcomed grandchildren into the world, and watched with pride as the ranch they had built together continued to thrive. They faced losses too, saying goodbye to dear friends like Jake and Mary, weathering droughts and harsh winters, dealing with the inevitable challenges that life brought. But through it all, they faced everything together, their love a constant source of strength and comfort. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. There was music and dancing, feasting and laughter. As Florence watched Garrett being spun around the dance floor by their granddaughter, she felt her heart swell with joy. This was the legacy they had built together. Not just the land and the cattle and the successful ranch, but the family they had created, the love they had nurtured, and the example they had set for future generations. That night, as they lay in bed together, Garrett pulled Florence close. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what? For choosing me. For choosing this life. For every single day of the last 40 years. Florence turned in his arms so she could see his face. Even in the darkness, she could make out the familiar features she loved so well. "There was never any choice, my love. It has always been you. It will always be you." They held each other as they drifted off to sleep, two hearts beating as one, two souls who had found each other against all odds and created something beautiful and lasting. The girl who had been left to die in a blizzard was long gone, replaced by a woman who had lived a full and meaningful life, surrounded by love and purpose. And the lonely cowboy who had saved her had found in her the completion he had been searching for without even knowing it. The Wild West could be a harsh and unforgiving place, but it could also be a place of second chances and unexpected miracles. Florence and Garrett Young were living proof of that. Their love story began in the worst possible circumstances, with betrayal and near death, but it transformed into something transcendent and beautiful. They proved that even in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost, rescue can come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, being saved is just the beginning of the greatest adventure of all. As Florence took her final breath many years later, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, with Garrett holding her hand just as he had held it through all their years together, her last thought was one of profound gratitude. She had been given a second chance at life that terrible day in the blizzard, and she had made the most of every single moment. She had loved deeply, lived fully, and left behind a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. Garrett followed her just a few months later, his heart unable to bear being without his beloved Florence. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names and a single inscription: "Together in life, together in eternity." And so the story of the woman abandoned in the blizzard, and the cowboy who saved her, became part of the folklore of Montana Territory, a tale told around campfires and passed down through generations. It was a story of cruelty overcome by kindness, of despair transformed into hope, and of love that conquered all obstacles. It was a reminder that even in the harshest winters, spring will come again, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the doorways to our greatest blessings. The ranch continued to thrive under the stewardship of their descendants, and on the porch of the main house, the swing that Garrett built still creaks gently in the Montana breeze, a testament to the enduring love of two people who found each other when all seemed lost, and built a legacy that would never be forgotten.